Good morning. I'm really excited to be here. I have to admit, I've been a big fan of the creation and existence of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics for its duration. Certainly, I'm a software engineer, and watching this grow into a community that can help provide and develop a lot of the clinical expertise and processes and methodologies and things that we need to build that part of the future, I think is essential. So I think all of you have a really important role. I'm acting CTO at NHSX rather. For those of you who don't know, we're a joint unit bringing together the technology leaders, powers, and policy levers that used to be scattered across the Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS arm's length bodies with the aims of getting things done. That's why we're here. It's partly about shrinking what was an incredibly convoluted and long sign-off chain to get anything done or created or funded, and partly about bringing a dose of the internet culture to the way we deliver NHS technology. I'll start with a few words about what I do and what brought me here today. I'm a software engineer by training, and I know and love the NHS. 10 years ago, I designed and delivered a digital service to help junior doctors find their feet when they join a new clinical environment, rotate to a new hospital or a new post. The user need in this case was that it was taking the trainees months to figure out who their colleagues were, what training sessions they had to attend, where HR was, things that really matter when you start a new job, but that don't really matter when you're getting bleeped 60 times a day and people are dying. So it was a popular concept, but when we tried to deliver it for the entire Southeast, we found that it was really difficult to write software once and have it run in every hospital and GP surgery and university and everywhere else we had training posts, which is really frustrating because I know that we have figured out how to do that as a software industry. And I know that this problem doesn't just affect us who are writing code. Right across the NHS, the technology infrastructure is a story of disconnection, siloization, fragmentation, and a lot of frustration. So if I'm a hospital doctor and I've changed a patient's medication, their local GP might not find out until they get the letter in the post, as all of you know. Or if I'm a startup building an app to match locums to vacancies, I have to phone up individual HR teams and trusts because I can't get that data from something like NHS Jobs. Or say I'm an academic and I want to build a randomized trial into a well-known GP EPR system. Guess what? The consultants charge £1,000 per site to make the change. This is a big problem from the point of view of trying to create a learning health system where, of course, you need to be able to access up-to-date knowledge about the system from multiple points within it. So how did we get here? Well, partly it's a market failure. Too many tech decisions outsourced to giant incumbents. Too few suppliers battling for our business. But it's not just the market's fault. Many NHS managers don't like the disruption, the risk-taking, the constant iteration that the tech world thrives on. The NHS is optimized for stability, and for good reason. When you move too fast and break things, people get hurt. So that culture of caution, that imperative to do no harm, it gets reflected and translated through into procurement decisions. Stick with what you know. Don't rock the boat. No one in NHS IT has ever lost their job for not taking a risk. So that's the problem. And wanting to help solve it is what led me back to the NHS. The next question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, for me as an engineer, the first step is to take a step back and look at how the architecture is built. Most NHS patient record management systems are based on full stack contracts, where the hosting, the data, and the application that runs on the data are all welded together into a single proprietary system. This setup has two important consequences. One, you can only access the data you want through that vendor's proprietary application, meaning no interoperability between rival vendors. And two, it's difficult to make any changes to the application layer without breaking the technical plumbing underneath it. To put it in more consumer-facing terms, it's a bit like if you could only use Apple's own apps on the iPhone, which incidentally was their original plan. So you couldn't have Google Maps, you couldn't have WhatsApp or Spotify. And if you wanted those apps, you'd have to buy a completely new phone for each one. Imagine how much slower and more expensive and more exclusive our digital economy would be if that's how the internet worked. Fortunately, that is not how it works. And it's why a big part of the solution is to make NHS technology more web-like in structure and design. That means separating out that data layer from the application layer, so it's easier to plug in new apps, and indeed to discard old ones that no longer meet your needs. It means collectively, as a community, agreeing the standards and ontologies that we need in our data. If we succeed, it will mean, for example, if a patient comes in with a headache and the tests indicate a migraine, and you need to record the reason they came in, which is the headache, and your diagnosis, which is the migraine, as distinct data points, you can build an application that lets you do that, rather than having to code all the information into one field marked problem. And it'll mean that you'll be able to run that app in any GP surgery in the NHS that wants to help, without having to pay one of the big vendors for the privilege. This should unlock the technology for the kind of computational biomedical knowledge work that you all are doing. And if it doesn't, we need you to help us make that work. So how do we actually create that open, interoperable, internet-like architecture? Well, I spend some of my time with the W3C, working on the architecture of the World Wide Web. And from that, I've learned that in a system as big and complicated as the web, or indeed the NHS, a standards-based approach is the only one that makes any sense. We can see this in the NHS because we've tried everything else, from attempting to control it all centrally to letting local organizations build and buy whatever they want. A standards-based approach means centrally agreeing the rules of the game, but allowing local freedom within those rules, which is, of course, how the internet works. It's not an accident that an email sent from Gmail can be read in Outlook, or that the Twitter app works both on Android and on iOS. It's because the developers have deliberately agreed to follow the same technical standards. Indeed, following the same standards as your competitor is virtually a precondition for participation in the system. We need a similar approach in the NHS by agreeing standards for interoperability, cybersecurity, user experience, and so on. Crucially for your work, we need widespread adoption of standardized diagnostic and reporting codes so you can track the clinical evidence you need across the NHS. Agreeing and mandating standards for the NHS is going to be a big part of our work at NHSX in the coming months. We need to decide collectively which use cases we should adopt standards for and which standard we should use for each use case. Wherever possible, we will use mature open standards like FHIR or HTTP APIs. And where no standard meets our needs, we will work with standards development organizations to improve existing standards. This process needs to be as collaborative as possible. We need input from clinicians, technologists, patient groups, suppliers, and wider civil society. And we'll definitely be tapping into your network as we collectively shape the standards agenda. There's a really important piece of work, I think, to explore some of your behavioral insights in the context of a clinician-facing UI standard, for example. As one of you has been kind enough to share from your research, we know, for instance, that clinicians are more likely to record symptoms that support an initial diagnosis while discarding those that contradict it. Is there a way of building a user interface that counteracts that cognitive bias? And what should that mean for our ecosystem? It could be great fun to find out. The work we're doing on standards is completely fundamental to our approach at NHSX. And because if you want to build a future, you first need to build your team, I want to use this opportunity to plug a few jobs. Over the next few months, NHSX will be looking to fill lots of roles, including a director of standards and interoperability to build up this community-based standards process, a director of architecture so that data can flow and we can have nice APIs and things, a director of platforms so there's a lot to build on when you start a project, and a director of skunkworks for fun projects to shake up the status quo. We'll be publicizing all the details on our LinkedIn page and on Twitter, so watch this space. Beyond this work on standards and architecture, I think the other single most important thing we can do at NHSX is to get the system out of your way where it's not wanted. We're not interested in doing that much innovation at the center. Instead, our role is to support the real innovators, both out there in the market and in the frontline NHS. This is partly about getting the right policy framework. For example, we can't regulate a new app as if it were a new drug or a new pacemaker. And we need IG rules that are easy to follow, so people are clear about when they can and cannot share data. But it's not just about policy. Culture, process, institutional ways of doing things. These all matter too. For many NHS providers, it's easier to stick with the same old supplier than the new kid on the block. And for suppliers, it's often easier to sell us an off-the-shelf product originally meant for something else, because we haven't been clear about our user needs. We talk a lot about building the ecosystem, but a big part of that is about building awareness. Awareness in the market about our many different procurement frameworks, where you need to go and how you can join. In the NHS, awareness about the sheer range of proven and effective health tech tools that already exist out there. And for all of us, awareness of the user-centered agile methodologies that give us so many useful tools in our personal lives. Because those approaches are already working wonders where we already use them in health. I want to make one final point. All of this technology is rapidly evolving. Every year, it gets faster and more precise. Many people predict that it will one day surpass human intelligence. That may be true, but it will never surpass the human kindness or compassion I see every time I walk into an NHS hospital. These tools may be able to treat patients, but they will never be able to care for patients. That's up to you, and we're here to help. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry that I can't stay.
Thanks, Hadley. Well, I will say one thing. I used to work for the HSCIC until 2014 as Director of Clinical Information Standards, and I wish that Hadley had been my boss.
We are hiring.